Wow. Okay. Thank you, guys. I see some of you actually woke up after the wonderful game night yesterday to come and listen to a keynote. So that's wonderful to see. I think with amount of actions we had last evening, there would be a lot less of you up here in this early hour. Okay. Well, what I wanted to talk to you today is two of my big passions, the open source and databases. And my agenda is really to convince you what the open source databases are taking over the world. Well, I thought if you guys came to this conference, you may really not need to be convinced. So I want to give you some facts and some ideas so you can go out there and spread the word, convince your friend, convince your boss, or anybody else. I also want to talk to you about the understanding open source better, about some pitfalls in the open source software and some differences between different kinds, as well as talk a little bit about the migration patterns we see from some legacy closed source software to open source databases. Now, based on some feedback, you can see what the open source databases are already won in certain areas. This is based on the Gartner research, right? We see what the huge amount of companies already run open source software. And really what is the most fascinating for me is what they predict what by year 2018, more than 70% of the in-house applications are going to be implemented using open source software. That is really fascinating numbers. But it's not only about the future, right? You guys, if you think about the, what I would call the mindshare ranking, right? This is what is provided by DB rankings. And we compare the quintessential, the closed source ecosystem, Microsoft SQL Server, which until recently was only available on closed source Windows, right? We can see it was losing popularity last years, right, compared to MySQL, right? And if you guys may have heard, I think even Microsoft recognized what the open source is important, and they promised to make Microsoft SQL Server available on Windows sometime in the future. Well, that's going to be interesting. So how did we really get here, right? Let's talk about a brief history of open source and our open source database in particular. So if you look at the late 90s, early 2000s, Web 2.0, right, and a bunch of kind of enterprise companies embracing technologies. At that time, a lot of companies were embracing some open source, like Apache Server, but on the database side, that is where we didn't see as much. A lot of technologies at that time really were used open source databases, right? So for example, if you look at the Oracle and Sun sales in the late 90s, they really grow by 50% a year, right, or more, because there was so much consumption for this technology. Well, we know what happened next, right? We had the dot-com crash, right, and money kind of evaporated. And the new startups, which had to be started at that time, they just had to be much, much more efficient when it comes to their technology use. Nobody really had the money to buy the big sandboxes, right, or spend money on Oracle licenses, right? So if you look at the next generation of software in the internet, all of that, or most of that, was based using on the open source technologies, right? And early on in 2000, MySQL was the default choice for as a database engine. Now, this is about the web. But what about the enterprise? The enterprise is interesting, right? Because as much if you look at how many servers we deploy, right, or amount of traffic and internet and so on, of course, right? Of course, that is the web companies. But if you look at who is actually customers of major software companies like Oracle, Microsoft, and whatever, these are the large kind of traditional brick-and-mortar maybe enterprises. And if you look at those, the penetration of open source database and enterprises is not as ubiquitous as it is in the web, right? We see what that is happening, but a lot of core applications, the most critical for a company's success, still would use Oracle and database of this type. Now, why does that happen? Well, because in enterprise, the economics are substantially different, right? In a lot of cases, we don't have so much pressure to be as much efficient because IT budgets is much smaller a portion compared to somebody like Facebook or Google, which have to run a lot of servers to produce their revenue. Also, the cost of downtime of that single server may be much higher. And I think what is also very important, in a lot of cases where existing technical team have no experience with open source, right, and often doesn't quite want to move or even be feared, right? If you have been an Oracle DBA for your last 30 years or something, right, and here is, young guys coming in and try to, hey, let's move to MySQL, you may not be very comfortable. That kind of can put your job at risk. Well, even if all of those, we see the great momentum of open source in the enterprises. And I think what is really interesting here, I think one of the best things which happened for open source database in the enterprise is the fact that Oracle acquired MySQL in 2009, right? Well, many would say at that time, oh my gosh, that was the worst thing ever. Oracle was going to kill MySQL. It's so horrible, and so on and so forth, right? And yes, certain things changed for worse, right? Maybe we got some open core features from Oracle. Maybe we don't quite see all the changes in the open source repository just as developer commit them. Maybe not every test set is open. But if you look at the big picture and if you look at the enterprise, the MySQL open source database now have Oracle seal of approval. And that makes it OK to use by default for many of enterprises, right? And I think that is wonderful. Now, of course, enterprises move slow, right? And the process of moving to open source at the enterprises is ongoing. But we see what the open source database, and MySQL in particular, are getting closer and closer to the core. So I want to talk briefly about how do we see that happening, right? What exactly do we need for successful migrations? And I think in a lot of cases where key for enterprises is to make a shift in the mindset and understand the difference between MySQL and the database like Oracle. I like to explain that to folks this way. You should be thinking about Oracle as Cadillac Escalade. The MySQL is a bike, right? So you have to pedal fast to go around, but in the end, that's going to be good for your health, that's going to be good for your budget, and that's going to be good for environment, right? But that requires a mind shift, right? And we can see, for example, many folks choosing the bikes to get around in the cities, right? Staying healthy and saving environments. And I also see many new folks choosing the open source databases to move the enterprise environments. So let's look at more details. What does make the applications in the enterprise easy or hard targets for migrations? Well, on the easy side, it helps if the application is simple if there is a development team which is actually working on that application is available, so they can implement wherever the SQL changes or schema changes which need for things to work with MySQL. It especially helps if application already supports open source databases. Many of systems you can get now, they are adding support for many databases, including MySQL. And I think what is the most important is enthusiastic team. If a team is enthusiastic about moving to open source software, we will find a way to make it happen. Come on, guys. Facebook talked yesterday, and they run more than 9 billion of queries, right, on open source database technologies. 9 billion of queries a second, right, and store many petabytes of data. And they don't go down a lot, right? So you can do a lot with open source software. Now, when is it hard? Well, when you have a very complicated application, especially using some very complicated and advanced features, like, I have many pages of stored procedures and funky programming languages, right? Hard to move to MySQL. When there is no source available, right? Especially if you bought some external proprietary application which does not support MySQL, it may be very hard to move it, right? When application is no more maintained, some enterprise applications were written maybe 5, 10 years ago, right? And they just hammer on Oracle. There is nobody around there to know how to change the code. Would be hard again, right? And also, if a team is against migration, they will obviously see the glass as a half full and find certain features here and there which don't exist in MySQL, right? Well, and as I told you guys, there is a hell lot of difference between Cadillac Escalade and a bike, right? We should not expect them to be the same. Both have wheels, but that's about it. Now, the other thing interesting is what there are two approaches we see in terms of migration. One is migrating an existing application, and then another is do it as a part of an application rewrite. In many cases, people are moving the new legacy applications to the new ones, right? Which are using web, which are used some new framework, new programming languages. And often it is a very good idea to move them to an open source database as a part of that process. Another thing you should consider is what you should be looking at number of technologies available. In a lot of cases, the real power of an open source is not that there is going to one company, one technology which has the best answers for all your problems, but what there is set of technologies, each of which has certain benefits. And we see often when enterprise embrace open source, they end up choosing the right tool for their jobs and adopting several open source technologies at the same time. So why do we see open source attractive to the companies? Well, I see there are a few of the reasons. And one is cost. We often hear that open source is free, but if you look at the open source for any company, it is not really quite free, because you still have to have certain developers, database administrators, and so on to maintain that, right? It may be free for a developer who just have a lot of time on his hands and he wants to build his app, right? No need to pay for licensing fees. That's it, but that's not how enterprise is. At the same time, because open source allows you the choice of vendors, right, or allows you to implement things in-house, it allows you to be much more cost efficient. In terms of freedom, I think that's important for me, that there is no vendor lock-in through open source. You can use one of the many parties available, or you can choose to do it yourself. When you are working with some smaller companies, I think it's also very important what you enjoy additional protection. If some company which has closed source software goes out of business, well, you may have to really rush and figure out how to migrate things. If the software is available as an open source, you have more choices. Maybe somebody will pick it up, maybe there's other vendors available, or maybe you can just move support in-house. I think it's also important what open source helps us to get better innovation for software in general, because innovation is no more restricted to one company. Right? You guys saw, for example, Mark Callaghan talking about RocksDB yesterday. Right? And Facebook indeed put a lot of work in making both MySQL and MongoDB better. And there are a lot of other companies out there. Right? Even on this conference, you saw guys from Twitter, from Google, from Alibaba talking about how they're making MySQL better. We are also contributing a lot at Percona side. And I think that is wonderful. Right? That also means what if you, a company has an important need, you don't have to wait for vendors to do things for you. Again, Facebook is a great example. They needed more efficient storage engine, so they went ahead and built one. They didn't have to wait for Oracle to make InnoDB to perform the way they needed, try to be as efficient as they needed. So what things you may want to consider when you are evaluating open source software? Well, one thing is what the open source is really about the license of a code, right? And the open source doesn't essentially mean what the community is managed in the open source spirit. One thing I want to point out is what there is a term those days, open core, which is often mixed with the open source software. I don't believe the open core has anything to do really with open source, right? Beyond trying to use the name similarity for marketing reasons. The open core is something akin with shareware software, right, of 10 years ago. Then you are given like a little bit to try out, but then you ask to pay for a real thing, right? And that's typically not available on the open source license. I like another reason for open core software, or another name for open source core software, which is a crippleware. Now, another thing you should be looking at is in terms of distribution, right? Can you really not only have access to the code, but also download the binaries in a convenient way you can put to use, right? In many cases, you would say, well, we publish the code, but you have to be only subscriber to get access to our certified binaries, and that's the only thing which works. And if somebody else builds the binaries, that is not really the same thing. Well, to me, that is not the open source spirit. And the other thing is about the open source community, right? Does the community really embrace the spirit of the open source and invites open participation? Or is it really closed off, trying to restrict the flow of information, right? And so on. And I think this is the second time I'm going to praise the Oracle, right, in this case, how they handle MySQL. Oracle can be considered our biggest competitor, right? But I think they understand the competition game pretty well. We're very happy to see them coming to the conference here. We work with them a lot about making MySQL better on the technical issues. We come to each other meetups, and I think that is really great how even such huge and complicated company can embrace the open source. At the same time, we also work with MongoDB, and out there, our experience has been very different, right? The MongoDB doesn't want to participate in the show we invite them to. They don't really want that to talk to any MongoDB meetups. Well, I think we're going to probably say something wrong out there. And if it comes to the conference, we're not only invited as a speaker or allowed to sponsors, but they go through the trouble to go through the list of attendees and kind of unregister all of our registered engineers, right? To me, that is frankly bizarre how you can claim to be open source company but have such a relationship to community. But I think what is funny in this case is what I don't believe things like that can ever work, right? In the modern era with social network, Twitters, and so on and so forth, information will spread, right? And I don't think you have any other good choice than embracing the information flow and informing your community and informing your customers. Now, the governance. So that is another interesting thing in open source software. You can see certain folks are managed by a single company. MySQL, MongoDB, great examples. And there are other which are managed by foundations. You know, there is a Linux foundation. PostgreSQL is a great example. OpenStack. And both of those have both benefits and drawbacks. But I think it's very good to know which exactly open source projects you're working with. Okay, yeah, so I think I already spoke about the open community. Oh, I guess I'm so passionate about that, so I kind of just keep that for another 2 slides. Well, anyway, so where do we stand here at Percona? And we take a somewhat extreme approach, I would think. I think it's so extreme what many folks have been telling me for the last 10 years it can't possibly work. Our software is 100% open source, right? It's not open core, there is no restrictions for access. And yes, our clustering software and our monitoring software and our backup software, all open source. You can download them, use them, and you don't have to pay us a penny, even though we hope you will choose to do so. Ourselves, we're very much focused on removing, not creating a vendor lock-in, right? We have created, for example, Percona Extra Backup or alternatives to many commercial extensions in Oracle, so there is more solutions available in the open source environment. At Percona, our software is, we don't have any foundation, right? What we do is done by Percona, supported by Percona, and I think that makes sense for us because we see ourselves as participating in MongoDB and MySQL communities. We want their communities to be more successful, and we are playing by the rules which exist in those communities. And we are very much for open community. We always invite everybody to talk and share opinions on our conferences, other events, and so on and so forth. So you guys may ask me, in this case, okay, guys, so does that mean you are this kind of some freaky open source zealots at Percona? And that will be a very, very valid question to ask. Now, the answer is no, right? I would define our answer, our approach to things as open source first, not open source only. I believe then for the same solution, for the same problem, both open source and not open source solutions exist. Then the open source is going to be a better choice. It's going to be a better choice for you as a user, right? And I think that's a better choice for the community as a whole. But at the same time, I believe for certain things, we're not going to see the good open source solutions for a time, right, or maybe a year, for forever, because of just economics, what it takes to build them. So because of that, we are really working with many partners to bring the good proprietary technologies to our customers as well. We have a lot of customers which run their MySQL workloads at Amazon AWS services with RDS MySQL or Aurora. That works great for them, and for many that is actually a great choice. We also work with companies, Vivid Cortex, SolarWinds, several nines, which provide a monitor and management software which is often much superior to any open source software which exists out there, right? And we want our customers and users to be aware and embrace it when that makes sense. So our main goal at Percona is really to help you to have the best solutions for your problems, right? Open source or not. So as a final thoughts, world is embracing open source software. You got my idea. And there is a lot of good reasons for that. There is a safe way to migrate to open source software if you approach it right. And then not all open source software projects and vendors are equal, so make sure you really understand how things work. Couple of more things beyond final thoughts. One is we want to thank again all our sponsors. We love you guys. You help us to make an amazing conference. And also, I mentioned what MongoDB folks don't quite want us to participate in the event. So we are putting on our own event in New York. And we would like to invite all of us, of you, to come to participate as speakers, as attendees, as sponsors. If you have anything to share, you're welcome. And you don't have to agree with me a single bit. That's it. Thank you.